So welcome everyone to the first Community Networks training session of 2020. We are very excited to put this together despite all of the issues going on with COVID-19, and we're really lucky that we're able to gather virtually and that people are able to join us over the phone as well. I have a few housekeeping reminders I want to roll through before I turn it over to our great group of panelists. So first of all, we want to ask that you please keep yourself muted. We record all of the sessions so that you all can go back and watch them later or send them to whoever you think might find them helpful. And so because of that, we'd really like to minimize interruptions. If you have a question, please bring it up in the chat. If you're on the phone, we're going to have a question and answer session later, so you can speak up then if you can't access the chat. And one other thing is that we issue certificates for people who also ignore the trash outside of my apartment window right now. But we issue certificates for everyone who has attended all of the sessions. If you miss one because you have some schedule conflict, but you go back and you watch the recording, just email us and let us know, and we'll take care of that and mark that you have attended all of them. A few more things is that we want to plug our Indigenous Connectivity Summit. If you haven't registered for it yet, you can do that on our website, and I'm going to drop a link in the chat at some point during this webinar. And finally, I'm going to drop a link in the chat right now. You can find our speakers and resources for upcoming sessions on our website, and it's password protected, so the password is also included in that message. So I believe that is all for housekeeping. I'm going to turn it over to our three awesome panelists. I think it would probably be best if we could just go down the line and you all could introduce yourselves very quickly. And then I think we're going to go in the order of Chris and then Dustin and then Bumpy to talk about your work that you're doing, and then we'll move to question and answer. So Chris, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yes, thank you, Hannah. Anna, not Hannah. So I'd like to start out. I'm Chris Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. It's great to see a lot of folks that I know have been through this before, that I met last year when I went through this for the first time and got more involved in this community. I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which is mostly known for, in our broadband work, focusing on community networks, specifically a lot of work on municipal approaches and cooperative approaches, but also advocacy for a variety of local approaches. So I'll be talking a little bit about the general background. I'll be handing it off to Dusty and then Bumpy. And Dusty, I think you can probably introduce yourself next.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Dustin Loop here, and I am Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. chapter of the Internet Society. We focus on a lot of things ranging from policy discussions to being the Secretariat for the Internet Governance Forum for the USA, but we've also recently increasingly been involved in direct connectivity initiatives with getting some community network and some hotspots up and running in Baltimore, which we have classified as, for the purposes of this at least, part of the greater Washington, D.C. area, which we serve. And so we'll look forward to talking a little bit about that. And I see a lot of people in attendance here probably know a lot more than I do. So I'll ultimately just tell you how we did it, not how you should do it.
Hey.
Bumpy, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly and then we can move on to our presentations?
Okay, aloha. Sorry, getting used to using this Zoom technology, man. Anyway, my name is Bumpy Kanahele. I'm the head of state of the nation of Hawaii. I'm glad to be here. Anna, thank you for making this happen. Sarah and Isa, thank you for supporting us, the nation, and our work that we're doing here in Hawaii. You know, I want to bring up something real quick. It's a legal foundation of the nation of Hawaii, and it's an extra challenge besides all the challenges that we have in the works that we're doing right now regarding broadband. But, you know, Hawaii was overthrown 100 years ago, 100 plus, it's 127 years now. And there was a bad time that we're still, you know, the memories of our kupuna, our ancestors till today is deep seated in us. And so excuse any Hawaiian who is like, you know, totally obnoxious, you know, at times, you know, it can happen. And I deal with that all the time with our people and stuff. And because the history is so heavy, so bad that the nation has taken a step to make that work in a whole different way. It's going back to the suppressor, oppressor, and working with them, and actually seeing if the generational change has been made in this generation, not my generation or the generation, you know, past, this generation. And I think that's the way the change is happening. You know, the younger generations are stepping up to the plate and stuff. And I want to be part of that because I'm the older generation that recognizes that. And I want to make that happen for us here in Hawaii. Use us. Use what we're doing here in Hawaii. The nation is more than happy and real thankful that, you know, ISOC came along. Who would have thought that we would be working with the state of Hawaii, you know? So I'll leave it with that. I'm looking forward to sharing more of some of the stuff we've done. But if you want to find out more information, look at the nationofhawaii.org. Everything is there, nationofhawaii.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Bumpy. And I think anyone who's dealt with you knows that you're both young at heart and rich in experience. I'll just say that another place you can look for some background is an interview that I did with Brandon last year on the Community Broadband Bits podcast. So if you look for Brandon Maka'ava and our interview with Matt Rantanen as well, we try to do a little bit of an introduction to this material. I think, you know, I've been working in community networks for 13 years, and I think that they are fundamentally about change and about making, bringing out, you know, I think really expanding the power of people who are powerless, people who have been run down over time. Most of the people that are on the networks today in the United States on broadband networks are on cable or telephone networks that are built by private companies that have an interest in serving a certain percentage of the audience of the country, not everyone. They are trying to serve people who have been empowered, the people who have kind of written the history books in many ways, and they have no interest in connecting the people who haven't. The great thing about the internet is that unlike the cable networks, we have a say in that, and we can build our own networks to get our message out. You're going to hear that story in part of this. I do want to warn one thing. If I disappear in the middle of nowhere, it's because Dell and Microsoft are conspiring against me, not because Comcast is right now. My computer's been quite flaky. And I've been flaky because ragweed is killing me this year. So I'm going to do the best I can, but I'm a little less coherent than normal. I'm going to do a bit of an overview, and then I think Dustin and Bump, you're going to talk more about personal stories. So I'm not going to try to make this into a coherent story. I'm just going to give some background, and I'm really hoping that we can answer any further questions in the chat toward the end. So as we talk about community networks and how to think about them, I tend to divide them into three different groups. Community networks fundamentally are networks that have a different goal in mind than what the cable or telephone networks typically do. It's a network that's meant to serve the community's needs. It's about creating benefits for the community, establishing education opportunities, about creating opportunities for work, telehealth, just opportunities to entertain ourselves and tell our own stories. It's not about creating money, although money is important to make sure it'll still be there tomorrow. But I divide community networks into three different groups that have some similarities and differences among them. One is municipal, which is where local government, maybe a city, maybe a county, maybe a township or some other jurisdiction owns the network. That's one group. Cooperative networks would be where the owners of the network are actually everyone who uses it. If you're using the network, then you have a vote in the governance of the network that hires the management and sets the policies and things like that. That's a cooperative network. And then the other is, I would say, generally local groups, often activist groups, often with volunteer labor, often using more creative styles. The first two groups that I mentioned, the municipal and the cooperative, are organizations, entities that can raise a lot of money. They can enter into capital markets. They can get major grants. We're talking about millions of dollars, not tens of thousands of dollars in grants. And so there's interesting ways in which those are related to community groups. But the community networks that we'll be talking about in here are more of the variety that are just scraping by often. They're trying to figure out how to get by to provide the best quality of experience without having a budget in the millions of dollars. And so they often use wireless technologies. There's a lot of different technologies that community networks use, but when it comes to these local efforts, a lot of times it's wireless because it's more affordable, it's nimble, it doesn't require the exceptional cost of fiber, which is often not just the cost of the gear, but also licensing it from companies that are charging a lot of fees and things like that. So we're often talking about wireless networking. Now, within wireless networking, there's a lot of different technologies. We talk about Wi-Fi, which is a common standard and is often how we often connect our devices, but it may not be appropriate to connect an entire community. There are other wireless technologies you may hear about, often broadly classified as fixed wireless, that are the technologies that we'll often be engaging with, which is slightly different than just Wi-Fi in ways that I think we'll be getting into more detail later on. But I think that one of the key things is this idea that at a local level, we have two challenges. We need to build a network locally that will allow everyone to connect that wants to connect. And we just have to make sure that they can all talk to each other with a high reliability. And that's one challenge, sort of the local distribution network, the network that's in our streets. And then the second challenge is how we connect that to the rest of the world, how we connect that to the larger internet. And so those, I think, are, as we think about community networks, it can seem really daunting and challenging, but we can kind of break it up. And the first part is something that many of us have done in our own homes, some of us already in our own communities, where, you know, it's just a matter of building a local network that works. And then the second piece is how do we connect it to the internet? I further break down this challenge when we think about the money involved with it into two different things. And one is, how do we afford to build that network? Like, how do we get it up and running? This is a kind of capital install question. And the second piece is, how do we keep it running after that? And so again, I just think about these different challenges into these, trying to break it down into more reasonable pieces. And the challenges of getting it running are often quite different from keeping it going. And it has to do with whether or not the network is charging, whether it's charging on a voluntary basis, is it raising enough money, what kind of deals can you strike to make sure that your connection to the rest of the internet is affordable. Those are the kinds of things that go in that. But I feel like that's at a fairly basic level, what needs to be done. I'm hoping now that with that kind of rough framework, that will help as Dustin tells his story and as Bumpy tells his story, you know, have a sense of the different questions we have to deal with and how different groups have dealt with them. But I'll be definitely paying attention to the chat here if people have questions as we go through these stories. But I feel like that's a pretty reasonable framework to get started. At least I hope it is. So Dustin, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, thank you for providing such great context to help as I tell the story here in Baltimore. I have some slides, some pictures and stuff, so I'll be sharing those. And So just let me pull those up right now. Here we go. So about a year ago or so, I was connected with a local organization and guy in Baltimore that was really interested in building out connectivity solutions across Baltimore, which has quite a few neighborhoods that are very underserved. I think a few years ago, they looked at it and found that something like 40% of Baltimore don't have adequate internet access. So we kind of just began with a conversation, none of us necessarily having any real background or in-depth knowledge of where to go. So I guess if get anything from this story, it's that really it just starts with a conversation and just trying to make things happen and learning along the way. So we have initially started out because, as Chris mentioned, there's the piece of getting people connected, and then there's the backhaul. And so we are still in the process of negotiating and securing a contract for dedicated backhaul. So we've started to build the infrastructure where we can actually get into people's homes and build out a real community network that gives people access within their homes. And in the meantime, while we're building out some of this infrastructure, we've been partnering with different groups to Rowdy Orbit, which is the group that we had been talking with initially, and then a group called Elevate, which works on a lot of community action in and throughout Baltimore. And so we have, while we're rolling out that infrastructure, put up these different hotspots at schools and churches and things like that. And this is kind of an idea. Here's aerial view of Baltimore and some of the areas that we are either currently in or slated to have a hotspot up in very soon. And this map will have more and more dots each week, hopefully. And so, you know, we initially thought of this as a longer term project, but with all of the shutdowns that occurred, we really had to kick things into gear and kind of start the work that we've been planning out a little bit earlier than we anticipated. But thankfully, we already had things in motion. So in February, we actually already had this community training. This is Jane Coffin running people through things about the community networks and the efforts of the Internet Society around that. If you don't know her yet, you should. And I'm sure you'll hear from her in the course of the different weeks that you have here. So so we just brought together different youth from Baltimore, 3 high school students, and a few others that came in and learned about some of the basics of the internet and community networks. And we also made sure to do some hands-on training, including configuration and kind of simulating mesh networks. And then once we got to some of the physical locations, working on things like wiring Ethernet cables and things like that. And so once we had the training kind of kick things off, we started working towards building different community partnerships. And so far, those have come in the form of schools and churches, as I mentioned. And in Baltimore, there's somewhat of a unique type of school that I'm not familiar with elsewhere, but it probably exists, where it operates in between what would be considered a public school and a charter school. So it receives public funding, but it's run by community organizations within Baltimore. So it's almost like a locally run charter school in a way, but they have a lot of flexibility over how they can partner and what actions they can take in order to serve their community. So that's helped us navigate or skip altogether a lot of the bureaucracy that we may have had to face with different public schools if we were operating within the school district in Baltimore. And then, you know, churches, it's just a matter of getting the buy-in from the pastor and the leadership and the congregation. And when they hear about what we're doing in the community, they're usually all about making their buildings available for us to extend our footprint. And so that's just a matter of making sure that we get the community involved. So when we've been doing installs, typically what we have been doing is, of course, having the young folks that we trained back in February, as well as bringing in new people from each neighborhood. When we go to a new neighborhood, the goal is always to have people that live in each neighborhood being part of this process to configure, install, and eventually maintain that. Because the idea is that eventually all of this will be transferred over to a worker-owned community cooperative that can be responsible for the maintenance and everything. And so we want to make sure that we're starting with those steps now. So it's just a matter of inviting in the community to be a part of the process and either observe or take part depending on what they're interested in. And that's been a kind of a great way to get more buy-in. And once we get to the point where we're actually getting into homes, we've built a lot of those networks and relationships that we'll need to rapidly get to that point. And so what we've really seen take off in the past few weeks, really, maybe the past month, is the awareness around the work specifically that we've been doing in Baltimore. And so what I'll say is once you get something up and running, be sure to tell your story. We started off just reaching out to local tech blogs and things like that. And then somebody caught wind of that at the NBC Nightly News. So our project was covered on national news, and then all of a sudden all the local outlets that realized that they missed this wanted in on it. And so now it's like every week somebody wants to do a story on the work that we're doing, which of course helps for getting additional buy-in and getting additional funding that we can use for the trainings and the equipment and all of that. And so that's really that's kind of the state of where we're at right now. We'll look forward to telling more of our story when we get a little bit further down the road. But happy to answer any questions once we get to that point in the session here. And other than that, I'll hand it over to Bumpy, which I imagine if he has any photos, they're going to be a lot prettier. So you take it away.
No way, man. Those are good photos, especially for this kind of work.
Unreal. Hey, aloha. You know, I left off talking about our challenge, the bottom line challenge that we have, but I want to share the establishment of Pu'uhonua o Waimanalo Village. We acquired the lands in June of 1994, 45 acres of land. The intention was to have a 55-year lease for these acreage, and basically so that it could become a traditional Hawaiian village. That stemmed from the apology law that passed in 1993, just a year earlier. So even the government at that time felt that they were responsible to like get the Hawaiian people moving, at least with some land base other than different trusts that we have, Hawaiian Homes or OHA or any of these different trusts that we have. So basically it stemmed from the apology law. Up to 1994, we did not sign any lease with the state until 2001. In 2001, the state finally put in a transitional clause to the lease. States in the event that a sovereign entity, sovereign nation of Hawaii is established for the benefit of Native Hawaiians, the Hawaiian people can now proclaim the restoration of the independence. The expiration of this term, lesser may give due consideration to transferring and or conveying the premises herein to a newly established entity. And so that basically was the beginning and the establishment of the nation of Hawaii with the state of Hawaii on the governor that came in after the original governor back in 1993. So with that said, the lands we've been on this lands, you know, for almost 26 years, about 26 years now. And so from that time till now, you know, we've seen 5 governors. Now, not all of the governors were kosher about working with us because we were like rebels out there on the street and they couldn't control. And so in the meantime, they had all these different federal, different ideas about federal recognition. They put in some legislation that didn't pass in Congress. And so they had another portion of our Hawaiian community in disarray, thinking that they needed federal recognition to protect the trusts and all that kind of stuff today. But the nation was totally looking for what the law accorded and was the right to restore our independence. And so in 2001, when we finally signed the lease with this clause in, that just made us like even more strong as we knew that this land was going to be for us at some point in time in the future. And that was, you know, literally it was 19 years ago. Now, this broadband initiative in our village, finally with Bert Lum, you know, as the DBED, you know, their main broadband person, I was introduced to Bert by another person, and we talked story about, you know, working with the state. And it was like, I'm going, yeah, right, we're gonna work with the state. But it was the Internet Society, the ISOC, that actually, you know, Bert was different. And again, you know, I was talking about a generational shift. You know, the generations of the old guard is like, they left. You know, they really left. The old guard is no longer here. Not the one that we deal with in Hawaii. And so Bert was a breath of fresh air coming from the state that said, hey, you know what, you guys be a perfect example to set up a community broadband initiative for you guys. And so we talked through it, and then we got to meet Mark Matt, and they came down and visited and started the ball rolling. And now I'm thinking like, well, we got to do all this other work, right? You know, and now trenching. I went right into the trenching. The trenching was something. I thought it was the hardest thing that we ever had to do, and I was wrong. The trenching was just the beginning of the hard work that we're about to do. And so we did the trenching, we laid the line, we got it right to the building. And I think, you know, we do that naturally because we have land. A land base is probably the most important thing for any peoples that are doing, you know, doing their thing. Because you always got to rely on a landlord. We don't have to. We don't rely on a state for anything. And that is probably why we get iced out a lot, you know, not just from the state government, federal government, even from some of the, you know, like Hawaiian Electric, the utilities companies, they make it hard for us here. But it doesn't stop the self-determination that we have the right. We have the right to pursue. And so this broadband initiative, it didn't dawn on me that how it would increase our communications between each other. Not just in our village, but even outside of the gates of this village. But you know, even till now, almost a year later, there's so many things that, you know, I've learned that you know, what our villages or villagers are doing, you know, the things that they're starting to do with the availability of the technology, availability of broadband here. And, you know, me and Brandon, we live in a Hawaiian homestead land. We have small lots out there in the community, in the Hawaiian homes community. And, you know, I was telling Brand, man, we got to figure out how to set up here, which is maybe about 7 miles from here. It's the other end of Waimanalo. But when you have something going here and you know, the work that you got to do here and the maintenance and the upkeep and all that, I think, you know, then your mind starts to wonder. And, you know, like we're outside, so I'm going, geez, you know, how much people cannot get connection, high-speed connection, let alone, and how many people have devices and stuff. And our community, Waimanalo community, the old side that I'm in, it's bad. You know, it's bad. Communication is, if not for the parents, the mothers and the sisters and the aunties and uncles that are helping volunteer their time in school, we would never have good education in our communities. So we're surrounded, we're next to the elementary school there, and we're surrounded by digital divide, you know. Talk about digital divide in a very heavily Hawaiian populated area. And so doing what we do here in the village tends to, like, you know, make us wonder, like, out there, like, what if we could get, you know, what if we could get a, you know, be node up and CPEs up on certain locations. We use our house as a connection, right? Then the reality of the present responsibility that we have, you know, because we got to do the management side, we got to do the administrative side, and then we also got to really learn that we got to charge people. You know, that has got to happen. And I think that's another challenge that we ran into in the last year was like, okay, we're going to charge people. Now, when you charge people, you want, of course, the maintenance or the technology side to be purring, you know, like really good. And we're still running into challenges. You know, it's every day we got a challenge, like, but we're learning, you know, we're learning, and there's a lot more things that happen in between of what I'm talking about, because a lot of physical work going into it. But the expertise that we're surrounded by is what makes, you know, that possible for us to do what we can do here on the land. You know, we got, you know, Brandon was sharing about the Aloha token, Brandon, that, you know, we started. And so we're using crypto tokens in here, right? That's going to be used for, that way our people can learn how to use cryptocurrency, use the wallets, use that stuff. In the meantime, pay their bills with Aloha token. We have an exchange wallet set up. And so those things can be applied on the outside, but we're going to work it in here. We're going to use it so that we can actually apply things like that. You know, we have a apiary, a bee apiary right now. We got over 11 hives. You know, we're starting to, John, who's our technical guy here, John Garcia, he's put together an app that helps us track the bees, you know, take picture, and then, you know, you can just download stuff in there. Now, once we get our reach out into the mountains, then we can do a whole testing on our farm products, on our water sources that we have. We have a pond out there. We got so many things we're excited about, you know, taking it to the next level as well. So before we get out into the broader community, at least we can dream there in how we would do things out there. But I think it's just getting a handle on what we have right now and making sure that it's happening. So I'm going to stop there as well. You know, I really think there's a lot of things that's going on for everybody, and so.
Bumpy, can I ask you a quick question?
Okay.
So one of the things that I found really inspiring when I was out there last fall, when the network was set up, was how enthusiastic everyone was. I mean, I think we had age ranges from less than 10 to more than 70 of people who were just super enthusiastic. And I'm curious, has that continued? Have people still been really engaged about how the network works and things like that?
No, man, they're engaging in the activities online. No, you know, the only time they report back to us if they're having problems connecting, right? Then there's a call that goes out to John and stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of enthusiasm. I think it's more a lot of usage. You know, like some of my nieces here are teachers, Hawaiian language teachers. So they have classes online from their houses now. They're actually being and setting up things like that for their schools, you know. I mean, you know, one of my nieces was offered a job as principal, you know. So the broadband technology in this village has really brought all those things forward, you know. And I guess you could call that enthusiastic and enthusiasm because they're using it, you know. They're using it for good things.
Great. And then I think we're all open for any questions if people have any. I don't know if everyone's able to see the chat, but we did talk a little bit with Wayne Kelly in the chat about local businesses can often be partners, local ISPs and things like that. And so my comments earlier are more about the big cable telephone companies, the big Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, those sorts of companies that are the ones that really only have an interest in serving people with the most money. But if people have a question they just want to, I think they can unmute themselves and ask it, or else jump in the chat.
This is Matt Rantan, and I'm just going to dive in. Dustin, I have a question for you. We had a conversation a while back about finding a backhaul or a drain to the rest of the internet for you. Can you talk a little bit about what that process was like for you, and what you had to go through to figure out, navigate that situation so that you could get to the rest of the world?
Yeah, so right now we are in the kind of last few stages of securing that contract and negotiation. So we haven't actually secured and connected our solution just yet, but in terms of the process of getting to where we are now, it was a matter of just trying to scope out the local players that have some sort of presence in Baltimore. And so we reached out to Cogent, and they were able to service our locations and gave us a pretty decent quote for in terms of what we were hoping for. We reached out to a couple of different smaller or mid-sized wireless ISPs to see if they would be interested in providing us with just kind of like a wholesale backhaul. And they were receptive in the conversation, but it never really got to a point where they provided us with a great bid or anything like that. And then the direction that we seem to be heading now actually came because they saw one of the articles that was written about the project, and they reached out, and it was a local data center in Baltimore that is located in one of the taller buildings that we have line of sight to at a couple of our key locations. And so they're willing to give us some space up on their roof, some dedicated backhaul, and some rack space, which we don't need now, but in the future might be useful for us. So I mean, it was just a matter of reaching out and seeing not only what the kind of prices were, but the timeline. So for Cogent, for example, they would have to dig and run a fiber line to the buildings that we're currently in, which we kind of wanted to avoid because we're operating with institutional partners at the moment who, as somebody who's worked in kind of community-focused organizations for a while now, when leadership changes, priorities can change and things like that. So the cost and time associated with getting that wired connection at this point doesn't seem like the right solution for us. And so we liked the kind of quicker nature in which we can get the backhaul up and running, and the ability of it to be more flexible if, like, we know, for example, that one of the buildings we're in now is going to be demolished in favor of high-rise apartment complex in the next few years, because it's an older school that the city's getting rid of. So with that in mind, we're kind of planning ahead and don't want to put too much investment into that at the moment. So there are a lot of different variables that went into that for us, but we're pretty close. We have the bid, and we just need to get the contract signed and then get our equipment up on their roof.
There's one thing I think to look at that's changed a little bit in recent years in terms of options for community networks to have this background connectivity, to have the backhaul or the drain to the rest of the internet. And that's some research and education networks are now open to this, and in particular Merit in Michigan, which is what we call an R&E network, which is to say that the schools, libraries, universities in Michigan almost all get their connectivity from an organization that is called Merit. In that case, almost every state has a network like this. Historically, they might have been reluctant to offer public bandwidth. Merit is certainly very active in finding ways to do that. And I think we've seen more open thinking, even before COVID, but certainly after COVID-19, from research and education networks as to how they can try to share their bounty.
I'll actually be speaking at Merit's conference coming up in October or November this year, and they're very open to that. So this started a while back with Scenic in California. And CNIC is the Research and Education Network, the kind of maybe the grandfather, at least the largest that we see, because it spans all the way up through Link, Oregon, and then into NOAANet in Washington State. It also spans across to Arizona. And CNIC has connected to the Tribal Digital Village Network and actually has made an amazing opportunity for us to reduce pricing, to add fat pipe bandwidth to be able to support this, and then be able to leverage all of the resources that this research and education network comes with. So we're working on that to try to replicate it throughout Indian country where applicable. And I think it's a great point, Chris. They were not in the play previously, but tribal libraries have opened their minds to that. The complication for them is that you have a government and an economic development venture and a library all in the same network, and they typically only look at the library or the school. So it's sort of a bending of their rules or a different understanding of the rules to be able to support tribal community networks.
All right, are there any questions that people want to shout out? You can feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, Anna, it's Sally.
Hi, Sally, how are you?
I'm good, I'm good. I was just wondering if any of the panelists would have any idea as to why it seems so difficult to build technical expertise at the ground level. Like I was in Hawaii last year and everybody seemed very enthusiastic about getting on the internet. And I just heard Bumpy say that, there still doesn't seem to be anyone around that's looking after the network there except for John. So, and I run into the same problem too in the communities that my company serves. So I was just wondering if anyone had, the panelists had any thoughts on why that is.
Yeah, the generational gap I was talking about, from the elders down to the keiki or the babies. I think that's something that I'm going through right now, because finding out exactly what is this generation into, at that level. What are the 4, 5, 6, 10-year-olds into? And the connection I made was, years ago, I used to complain about my grandchildren being on the internet and doing all this, and they playing these games and stuff, until I jumped into that game and asked them, what you guys doing? And they told me, well, creating their cities, creating buildings, they're building these things online. And I'm going, so, and then what you guys do? Well, to get more points, I guess you gotta rent out the spaces and all that. And then, see, what happened was my youngest granddaughter, she's like around 8, and my older granddaughter, they got into it, a cat scrap with each other, and it was over the internet. And it was because the younger one, who seemed to be very very technically savvy about what she was doing, and she spends a lot of time, so I realized that she was getting a lot of the perks, right, that goes with the game she's playing. And the sister, she gave the sister the password, or a way into, and the sister didn't pay her bills, and they had this fight over what was going on online. Now I talked to both of them, and I told them, you guys fighting about rent, not paying your rent, not, you lavish cars that you buying, really, the older sister, right? This is a game now. And I brought them out, and I said, what's happening is you guys spend so much time in there. Then the chores of the house chores, the yard chores, the dishes, the cleaning of the jobs that should be done in real time. You guys not doing those things, and you spend all this time in the computer you know, managing things and, you know, but all those things are just thoughts passing by because you have no idea how to clean up, how to take responsibility for those things. So I realized that I had to get into their world to actually have a pretty good discussion with them about reality and when you're in the computer. And through that, I got my grandson. He's the like 22, 23 years old. Just had a baby, but he's gonna start working with John and Brandon. And when I see it, I know my grandson. He's reliable. You know, the people that we had working, they couldn't be there 24/7. You know, Brandon had to run from home, from outside, come back inside to restart, do some of the stuff. So the maintenance administration and the maintenance management of the whole ISP requires that. It requires that type of person and interest. And so I can say that I finally, I think we tapped into one of our, you know, he lives here, my grandson. And so I talked to him again yesterday because it's a big responsibility. It's not just, you know, we're going to take over, we're going to do that. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's got to happen now. But I think by getting in touch with them that way is what made me realize how I got to work with that type of talent. Or when you spot it, if you spot that talent in them, then inquire about that. Hey, why don't you guys see? And if they give you a signal that you're gonna know. And so I don't know if that answers it all, but that is the approach that I've taken, that we've been, you know, working at to get involvement by them. You know, it might be one of the 11-year-olds that's going to run the technical side of this place. Who knows? You know, but it's open. You know.
I'm curious, Dustin, if you though that, I mean, I feel like some of that also gets back to what you were saying about in terms of people feeling ownership of it, because I also feel like sometimes people will think I want to help, but I'm not really sure if I'm the one that's supposed to, or if I even have permission to, or that sort of a thing.
Yeah, no, thank you for teeing that up. I think there are a few things at play here. One, that having that local community ownership when you know, when they're up on the roofs installing this equipment, for example, as part of the training that they're going through and helping us out, you know, their friends are walking by, and it's a point of pride that, you know, they're part of this initiative that is going to help out their community, their friends, their family, their neighbors. And so I think that's a big part of it. But even with that, it can be difficult to build up that technical expertise and retain the technical expertise for a few reasons. I mean, the world's a messy place. There are a lot of complex situations that people have to live through that may make it difficult for them to be there consistently or reliably. And also there just needs to be an economic opportunity piece of this, where in communities that are overlooked and maybe don't already have kind of people within that community that are able to rapidly kind of deploy some of these community networks. Some of the community networks that are doing great work have the benefit of having really kind of networking experts helping with the deployment of it. And they might have the kind of privilege to be able to volunteer their time to deploy something like this, but I think that's not always the case. And so tying some form of economic opportunity to that, to actually allow the people that want to take that role to do so sustainably and to actually, you know, take care of themselves and their families in the process. And if you can find a way to, I think, well, establish that kind of local ownership and match that with some level of financial sustainability, I think that could be a really good formula for not only building, but retaining that expertise and the network as a result for the long term.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a few questions in the chat. The first one is from Lavish. If you want to unmute and ask it yourself, feel free to do that right now. If not, I can just read it out loud. All right, I'll go ahead and read it. So the question is, with exception to the COVID lockdown, what has been your major challenges in rallying people around this great transformation, pushing people towards community networks?
One thing that I would say that I think is important is the sense that it can be done. I feel like for people who have been overlooked, people who are used to not getting a fair shake, people who often already have some economic challenges, it can just feel like this is not something that's going to happen in the community. And so I think one of the things that's really important and that ISOC does really well is highlighting how this can work and how we can get it done. And I fundamentally believe that we will connect everyone in North America. I think we're going to connect everyone in the world eventually. You know, I think we're gonna get this done. And so I think one of the things that sort of, it can be easy but can be overlooked, is to make sure people have a sense that this is something that can get done because they'll put efforts into things, something that they believe can happen.
Dustin and Bumpy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of the biggest barriers prior to COVID, I actually think that COVID has not so much been a barrier as much as a catalyst for what we've been doing in Baltimore. We're fortunate that we got some of the preliminary steps out of the way before things kind of hit the fan. But leading up to that, it was convincing the kind of institutional partners that we needed to make this happen, that it was a worthy use of their already limited resources. And so once the schools went remote and people had to work remotely and access their healthcare remotely and all of these things, it just became their number one priority overnight, which kind of dealt with that barrier. So, I mean, now is kind of a great time to be trying to find community and institutional partners as well as funding. And hopefully that prioritization doesn't fade, when we get to a point in a few months or a few years where COVID's not on the top of our mind at all times.
Yeah, I think the major challenge, I think because the community had no access, or at least high-speed access at all, the everything is like a new thing. I mean, I see a lot of our village members in Facebook. I see them on Instagram. I see them on a lot of things that they would not have been on there had it not been for the technology, which comes back to, it's kind of like a baby that hasn't tasted a candy bar, and then you put that candy bar in your mouth and you go, wow, this tastes good, right? It's like that. I don't know, the major challenge to me is now getting them unspoiled in you know, the way we got to manage the thing, the way we got to add speed, high speed, up, down, all those things are yet to come. And I see that as the challenge in setting up after, you know, getting so used to that, you're getting support because we got to work out all the technical bugs and all these different challenges that we have to begin with. But the challenge I would see is yet to come, because we're working on that. You know, if you don't pay your bill, you're gonna get turned off. You know, that kind of challenges I'm talking about that we're looking at, because we got to do that. You know, we got to be prepared for it to see what it looks like. And I think that's where it is for us, that upcoming things that we got to face now that, you know, in the last 10 months, you know, our people have had high-speed connection. You know, although we had bugs here and there, you know, it's pretty much been better than, you know, than ever.
There's something that I thought was useful to note, that I was thinking about, both in the case of these community networks we're talking about, and that's getting something started, even if it's small, is really important, rather than waiting until something better comes along. And I don't know that Dustin has been able to take advantage of the CARES Act funding, but that's the sort of thing that you should be thinking about, where if you have some kind of a network operating, you'll be in a better position if money does come available, whether it's through philanthropy, whether it's through the state, whether it's through ISOC. You know, anyone that has money to distribute to try to build better networks or to achieve health outcomes or educational benefits, they're going to be much more interested in a network that has some evidence that it can work, to pour money into it, than one that just has a good plan. So one of the things in 13 years that I've seen is that it's always a few years, I mean, at most, between major programs where someone's trying to put money into networks for one reason or another, because we desperately need to connect people. And if you have something, you're going to be able to get toward the front of that line.
Great, thank you. And one more thing I want to flag before we move on to the next question is that our session next week is about the community of networking. And so we're going to dive really deep into this, and we have the resources on the website if you want to check that out ahead of time. The next question we had was from Claire. Claire, I see you right there if you'd like to ask it.
Sure, yeah, thank you very much to all the panelists. The information that you shared was really informative and pretty inspiring. I was just wondering if you could speak about any funding opportunities there are for covering operational costs, whether that comes from government or partnerships, or philanthropy was another one, that area that has been touched upon.
Yeah, I'd be happy to jump in with just a quick answer, and that's some of the networks have had a goal of trying to charge businesses rather than residents, and try to, you know, provide that value to businesses that may want to support the community, may have other reasons for getting that connection, and finding that they have more of a capacity to make sure they have some money each month. So that's one thing that has gone in the direction of generating some revenue for some community networks.
Yeah, and we're certainly not to any point of sustainability yet. We were able to take advantage of the increased interest in getting people connected. So we got started with a grant from the Internet Society, and then other groups, philanthropy groups, and community organizations around Baltimore got behind us pretty quickly and have been putting some funds into the startup of things. And then in terms of the sustainable business plan, maybe one thing that I haven't emphasized that I should is that in this context, ISOC DC is really just helping be an incubator. We're not going to be have a long-term stake. I mean, we'll always want the network to succeed and provide expertise and help when we can, but ultimately our goal is for this to be a self-sustaining network that is run completely locally. And so with that in mind, we'll of course talk with them about their business plan, but the sustainability and how they choose to structure any fee cost and things like that will be made more locally. So that aspect of it is not something that, from an ISOC-DC perspective, that we've put too much thought into.
Yeah, you know, that was our thought when we started working on the Native Hawaiian owned and controlled bank. I think that the nation is seriously really looking at a shareholder, stakeholder, beneficiary type of business, so that all those that are participating or have service would basically be shareholders of that business, of that you know, that entity. We've the nation is looking at doing some of the craziest things that countries would even think of, and that everything that we do, we want it to be in that light, that it will be shared by all Hawaiians, as well as the people that live in Hawaii. And so when you think about all the businesses that can come about, or that is operating right now, imagine an economy where the shareholders are people of that country, the people of that, you know, entity, whatever that may be. And that's serious. You know, we're just taking it beyond, because then with that in mind, then that becomes a talk about self-sufficient and sustainability. That answers, you know, some of the things that that we've talked about, you know, about you know, how do we take money from the guys that got money to help the ones that don't have in the community. And so we've talked about this a lot for years and years and years. I think we started the Native Hawaiian Bank Plan started back in 2000. It's about 20 years ago. And so that thought has always been in every area: universal health care, and housing, and education, which could offset a lot of the necessary funding or resources that would need to go to a, you know, community that don't have. And we're that community that don't have, so we understand that you know, how that can work when we get the opportunity. And I mean that, when we get the opportunity, that's, you know, that's one of the nation's top priority, is to look at all that ways to make, you know, not just make people users of whatever business that may be, in this case broadband, but become shareholders, stakeholders in that.
If I was to, I think a related suggestion is not actually along the spirit of sustainability, but in terms of a potential inflow of money that would probably be not sustainable in the longer term, is I would predict that we're going to start seeing some states and eventually the federal government putting money into digital inclusion, training for people to learn how to use the internet better, everything from security to just how to turn it on. And there's going to be groups in different places that'll be putting together these programs. And if you can couple it with a community network, I think there will be money available. Certainly, if the Democrats take the Senate and the presidency, they've already put forward a bill that they claim that they will be putting forward again in early 2021 that would put billions of dollars into these programs. And so it may be worth, to some extent in the short term, thinking about how community networks can engage in these training programs as well as distributing the connectivity.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I'm trying to see if there's any other questions in the chat. It looks like a lot of really good discussion. So by the way, I'm going to save this chat and cut out the private messages so you all can access it later. Are there any other questions that people want to shout out? Okay, cool. Well, before we go, I have a quick question that I want to ask. I think it's really important in these trainings that we try to keep language like accessible, and that we try to explain the really techie things that we talk about. And Bumpy, you mentioned trenching earlier, and I know that if I were just getting into community networks, I know when I was just getting into community networks, I had no idea what trenching would even be. So could someone just give a quick explanation as to what trenching is, what it has to do with backhaul, all that?
Yeah, so for many, even wireless networks, you often want to have a very high capacity fiber optic cable feeding the wireless network in the main like sort of distribution point. And to do that, you're pretty much going to have the fiber running underground in a trench in some form of conduit, which would be a pipe that's underground, or attached aerially on utility poles. Getting on utility poles can be really hard. Putting in new utility poles can be harder. And so a lot of times trenching or getting underground with some form of directional boring is better. It really depends on where you are, and also the people and their preferences. I mean, Matt can certainly tell us a lot about different tribes having concerns about going underground for this work. And I'll just say that, you know, if you do want to trench, probably on a volcano is not the easiest place to do it. Similarly in New England, if you're on granite, it's going to be really difficult. So, but if you're in the Midwest where I am, it's super easy. So it'll vary quite a bit based on where you are.
Yeah, for the tribes that are concerned about trenching, I mean, the biggest concern too is you know, are there artifacts buried where that trench may be going? With some of the disruption that's happened in our reservation systems and records that have been burned, and you know, stories that have been changed over the years about where things are. You know, your tribal historic preservation officer, as well as your EPA departments, should be involved before trenches are dug, and you know, consider all of the issues, because you know there were people buried in places behind, you know, where others were living, and you know, it wasn't a marked grave. And then there were, you know, areas that were culturally sensitive that may have been covered up over the years, that the artifacts would be disrupted and or destroyed if trenching happens. So, you know, there's all those considerations to deal with. And then, you know, the management of your property. And I can guarantee that Bumpy is working on this, and Brandon as well, where you have this community that is, in all respects, it's new in relation to time. So you are actually laying down infrastructure in your community, as a lot of these tribes are, and you're starting to put things in the ground, and you're starting to put more things in the ground, and then you come back next year and you put another thing in the ground. You got to remember where all the things are in the ground. You've got to manage your, you know, your assets that you're building, because you know, you can cut things, and fiber gets cut all the time. But it is the best solution to be able to bring enough bandwidth into a community to be able to, you know, expand and grow. So, you know, thought process there, working with fiber providers at wholesale levels, bringing that onto your property, figuring out what the best vantage point is for wireless from the fiber. There's a lot of considerations to have there, but you know, it is definitely a step that you want to consider and take. And you know, and cutting a slice into the ground that's several feet deep to lay a conduit through it that connects one place to the next is essentially where that definition comes from.
So there was also a question about aerial fiber deployments.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges is that, and I don't follow this as closely as some others do on the audience, I'm sure, but during the net neutrality fight, one of the things that was obscured was who has the right to get on the pole. And for a few years, if you wanted to offer broadband internet service, you had a right to be on a utility pole in the United States. I don't know. I haven't looked into the rules in Canada. I don't want to be US too specific, but I kind of have to be. Which means that right now you basically have to get permission from the pole owners, and they can tell you no. They can tell you have to write me $1 billion check. They can say a lot of different things. And so that has been a challenge. And then On top of that, if you have a business plan you're trying to do by a certain time, if you're trying to get on poles that are crowded and require others to move their stuff so you can get on the pole, which is a process called make ready, you have no idea if you're going to be able to get on that pole in 3 months or 9 months or a year. And so it can be very challenging. Depending on where you are, I think it's worth noting that sort of common things that are known in the industry, such as trenching, are very expensive. It may be different based on where you are. If you have a lot of people that are willing to do manual labor, depending on where you are, it might be pretty cheap comparatively. If you have access to a trencher and the right kind of land and the permission to do it, it might be something that you can sort of do in off hours. I think understanding community networks are going to be more nimble. They're going to bend rules that a city wouldn't do, that a 50-year-old telephone company might not do, and so it's important to be creative along these lines. But aerial fiber would be great if you can get through it. It's just that most of the community networks that we're dealing with don't have that kind of capacity or luxury, and so they're often trying to do point-to-point radio, wireless, until they can do some kind of wireless distribution of it.
Cool, thank you. So at this point, I think I'm going to do a last call for questions if anyone wants to shout one out.
Hi, Anna, it's Sally. I could speak about the pole attachment issue from a Canadian perspective. We pay to go on poles in our communities. We pay about $22. We were paying about $22 per pole, but last year the Ontario Energy Board doubled that rate. Well, mind you, there hadn't been a rate increase since 2007, but that's something that you have to consider if you want to build a community network. That's a cost that you have to look at. You're going to have to pay for a pole attachment. In our case, we're dealing with a local distribution corporation, like the power corporations are owned by the community. So the poles are owned by the community. So we've actually been able to have the pole increases eased in rather than them coming all at once. But yeah, it can get expensive. And sometimes when you're doing a community project, a way to get around the make ready time and the wait times is just to offer to do the make readies yourself when you're up on the pole. That's it, Anna. Thanks.
And Anna, I don't know, someone just asked about Starlink, but I think it's worth addressing for a quick second, which is low Earth orbit satellites that are coming online. We're starting to see some tests, and Will made a comment that it could be a good backhaul solution, and I think that's a good way to think about it. I think it's going to be too expensive for many of these communities to rely on for every individual person to get. I also don't think we're going to see the capacity from these to connect everyone in a given area. We'll only see them able to connect proportion of those, or a portion of those people, because they don't have the ability to serve a limitless number of people within a, say, 50-mile radius. They have a certain number of people they can serve. And so to the extent that you could build a network, particularly if you're in a more remote area, and then you could get 1 or 2 connections from Starlink to provide that backhaul, that could be a very attractive solution. There's still a lot of ifs, ands, or buts as we see how this evolves over the next 6 months, but it's somewhat promising for that, I think.
I think it would have been nice to have a competitor in the space, and now that the other two have kind of gone defunct, we may not have that for a while.
Thank you.
Great, so now I'll do another last call for questions if there's anyone who wants to offer one up.
I have one, just kind of basic empowerment of community leaders for anyone, Bumpy, either in your experience, or Dustin and Chris, what you've observed of a lot of people, maybe especially people who just got access to Spectrum. They are kind of starting from square one, maybe are overwhelmed or don't really know what the first step is. And so you know, you kind of hit these broad themes of like community buy-in, but what is kind of the first step, or maybe your advice to new leaders who are interested in bringing broadband to their community but don't really know where to start?
I think the same way that we had the opportunity, you know, is to you know, in what happened to the village is probably going to be duplicated in Waianae with the homeless community turned landowners now. They got 20 acres of their own land that they bought. So there'll be about 300 people that was on the beach will be moving up to the property. But it's you know, James is part of the group, the Hui, as well. And he's the direct connect with Auntie Twinkle and the Waianae population. But it's you know, finding those kinds of leaders that you know, when I remember when I first met James and Auntie Twinkle, you know, they came out of the blue sky and came visited us in the village and said, you know, how you guys did this? How did you get land? You know, what made that happen? And you know, and we helped them out. We gave them advice that you know, normally nobody would be able to give them because they had no experience in that field. And Auntie, you know, she was more of the social conditions of people. So you have a lot of these pockets of people just need attention and unknown. You know, they're doing a lot of work out there. They're unknown. They're part of, you know, a smaller community like us. And I think it's just knowing that they can tap into the resources and the connections and the contacts. And of course, you know, that wouldn't be any Tom, Dick, and Harry that you're like pointing in the direction of you folks. And I think that everybody, you know, that we've met in, you know, from Internet Society and all you folks has brought that confidence to us in knowing what and the stuff that we're doing. We don't know everything, so when you don't hear us talking about anything, that's because you guys are around, and the experts are the ones that will be in the details. So the leadership is going to show up. It's kind of like when the student is ready to teach our peers, and it's kind of like that way. It has been that way for me in the movement in spotting other things. But the broadband section, never did it before in my life. All I know that you can connect, you know, and that connection has got to be shared.
One thing that I'd recommend is whether it's by a text or email or some sort of group that has a history, you know, feature of like Google Groups kind of thing, but getting a lot of the folks that are on the same page together. And so they can work through it when they're dealing with different vendors. They can share experiences. You know, it's actually somewhat helpful that I feel like they're almost all entering at a similar timeline where they'll all have access at the same time. More than 100 people, I'm assuming, ultimately, well over, hopefully. And so the ability for them to work through those issues and to solve their own problems internally, and then kind of escalate to whether it's someone like Matt or someone else when they find something that no one else in that group has dealt with, I feel like can be really helpful and form like the bonds that hopefully will help through generations of this technology.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to that, and I think reiterate some of what Bumpy was saying, is really just the way that we got started is just talking to as many people as possible that have already taken a few of the steps. And I think you'll, you know, find in the community networking space and similar communities, there's always a willingness to help and share knowledge. And without that, none of this would have happened in Baltimore. And I think maybe, you know, Internet Society can be a good facilitator to try to connect people with others who maybe have already done similar things. And then, you know, when you get to a point that you can share knowledge, turn around and be help other emerging leaders get started as well.
Great, so thank you. We have 3 more minutes, so any other last minute questions? All right, great. So thank you all for joining. This has been a really wonderful discussion. I will be saving the chat also, so you can all access it later. There's a lot of really valuable information in it and some really wonderful discussion. So yes, thank you all for joining. If you'd like to connect with us, my email is higgins@isoc.org. I will put that in the chat right now. I can put you in touch with any of our panelists, and yeah. So see you all next week. Very excited that you all joined us, and see you later. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.